My stepson wrongly accused me of hitting him, so I left my wife, and now my marriage and family are in shambles. Here's the situation. I'm 40 years old, and I've been married to my wife Rebecca, who's also 40, for 5 years. She has 2 kids from her previous marriage, Zach, 10, and Chloe, 8. I also have a daughter, Lucy, who's 7, from my previous marriage. Life was generally good, with the usual ups and downs, but we managed to blend our families together. At least, I thought we were doing well until one evening when Zach completely ruined everything. It was a regular Tuesday evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I got home from work, and the kids were already having dinner. I sat down, and Rebecca smiled at me, and we started chatting about whatever. Then, out of nowhere, Zach looked at me across the table and said, "You hit me." Just like that. No lead-up or anything. At first, I thought it was a weird joke. Kids say strange things sometimes, right? So, I just dismissed it and asked, "What are you talking about?" But Zach wasn't joking. He insisted that I hit him a few days earlier when Rebecca wasn't home. I was shocked. I've never laid a finger on that kid, or anyone for that matter. I don't believe in that kind of discipline, and I've never even wanted to. So, I said no and looked to Rebecca, hoping she would back me up. But instead of saying anything, she just stared at Zach, then looked at me as though she was processing it. I could tell she didn't believe me, just from the expression on her face. A wave of panic hit me. It's hard to explain, but it felt like the room got smaller. I was torn between wanting to defend myself and not knowing how to. How do you argue with something that's a complete lie? How do you prove you didn't do something when there's no evidence to back you up? It was his word against mine, and I could see Rebecca's trust in me slipping right before my eyes. "Are you serious?" I asked her, standing up from the table. "You really think I hit your kid?" She didn't respond directly, just said, "We need to talk about this." I tried to stay calm, but inside I was falling apart. We went into another room, and Zach stayed behind with Chloe and Lucy, acting like nothing was wrong. Rebecca shut the door, and then she asked, "Did you hit him?" I said no again, but she kept pushing, asking me why Zach would lie about something like that. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Maybe it was for attention, or maybe he was upset about something. The only thing I knew for sure was that I didn't do what he was accusing me of. But Rebecca still didn't believe me. The more we argued, the more defensive I got, and it only made things worse. She was in full mama bear mode, as if I were the enemy now. I just snapped. "I'm not staying here if you think I'm some kind of abuser, Rebecca. I'm not risking my life or my daughter's life over this," I yelled. I stormed out of the house, not even knowing where I was going. I just needed space. I called my best friend Dan, pacing up and down the street, trying to process everything. Dan's the type of guy who's brutally honest, and he wasn't pulling any punches. "Dude," he said, "you need to get the hell out of there now." I wasn't sure what to do. This was my home, my family, and I didn't want to leave. But Dan wasn't wrong. "Look, no one's going to believe you over a kid. It's not fair, but it's how it is. And if things go south, you could lose Lucy," he added. That hit me hard. I hadn't even considered that things could get that bad. But once Dan said it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if Zach made up something worse? What if Rebecca went to the police? It would be his word against mine, and I had no idea how that would unfold. I walked around the block for hours, my mind racing. Deep down, I knew what I had to do, even though it felt like tearing my life apart. Eventually, I returned to the house. Rebecca was still in the living room, and Zach had gone to bed. I told her we needed to talk. Really talk. I sat her down, took a deep breath, and said, "Look, I didn't hit him. I don't know why he's saying that, and frankly, I don't care why anymore. What I care about is that I don't feel safe in this house. She stared at me like I had slapped her. Safe? What do you mean you don't feel safe? She asked. I mean, if you don't believe me, I can't stay here. If you're already on his side, how long before something worse happens? What if Zach says something else that could ruin my life or take Lucy away from me? My voice was shaking as I spoke. I can't risk it. Rebecca stayed silent, but I could tell she knew I was right, though she didn't want to admit it. I tried to stay composed, but inside, I was a mess. I understand why you're protecting your son, I said, and I don't blame you for that. But I'm not going to stick around and wait for the next accusation. The last thing I want is to be near someone who could turn on me at any moment. I packed a bag for Lucy and me. Rebecca didn't stop me or say a word. I think she was still in shock. As I walked out, I told her, "We can talk later, but for now, I need space. Only contact me through text. No calls." She nodded. I left without looking back. That night, Lucy and I stayed at my parents' house. I didn't tell Lucy the whole story. I just said we were visiting Grandma and Grandpa for a while. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind kept replaying the conversation over and over, trying to figure out how we ended up here. How did a kid's lie destroy everything? I could already see the future ahead of me, and it didn't look good. Things would never be the same. After leaving, things were incredibly quiet. Rebecca and I barely spoke for the first few days. It felt like we were both walking on eggshells. Every time my phone buzzed with a message from her, my stomach dropped, wondering what new accusations she was going to make. But honestly, the texts weren't what I expected. At first, Rebecca was all over the place. I don't blame her. One moment, she was angry. The next, she was apologizing. And then she'd send long texts asking to meet and talk things over. It was exhausting. I read her messages, but I didn't respond right away. What was the point of talking in circles if she wasn't going to believe me? The strangest thing, though, was how quickly she switched from blaming me to blaming herself. One minute, she'd say, "I'm just trying to protect my son." And the next, she'd say, "Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I didn't think it through." But by then, the damage was already done. Honestly, I don't think she knew what she wanted anymore. Part of her was probably hoping she could smooth things over and act like everything could go back to normal if we just talked. But there was no going back. Not after she doubted me like that. The problem is, once that line is crossed, it can't be uncrossed. The first few weeks after I left were tough. I was torn between trying to protect myself and wondering if I was making the right decision by walking away. I missed Rebecca, of course, but every time I thought about her, I saw that moment when she sided with Zach without even hearing me out. It played over and over in my head, and I couldn't shake it. Lucy adapted better than I expected. She didn't ask many questions, and I was grateful for that. I told her we were staying with Grandma and Grandpa for a while, and she accepted it. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for. I tried to keep things as normal as possible for her, going to the park, playing games, keeping up with her schoolwork. I wanted her life to feel stable, even though mine was falling apart. Meanwhile, Rebecca's texts kept coming in, and they started getting more desperate. She said things like, "I miss you," and "We can fix this." But how do you fix something like that? How do you move on from the fact that she was willing to believe her son's lie without even questioning it? I told her the same thing every time. I'm not coming back until I know it's safe for me and Lucy. That was the bottom line. No matter how much I missed her, I couldn't risk everything on her just deciding to trust me again. That kind of trust doesn't come back so easily. Then, about 3 weeks after I left, I got a message from Rebecca that made me freeze. It was different from all the others. She said, "I believe you now." Just like that. Out of the blue. I had to read it multiple times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. After I left, Rebecca started reflecting more on what Zach said and how he said it. She noticed things that didn't quite add up. His story kept changing, and as she questioned him more, inconsistencies began to surface. Eventually, she realized that Zach had been lying all along. I should have felt relieved, right? That's what I had been waiting for. But honestly, I didn't feel relief. I felt anger, fury, actually. It was like, great, now you believe me. But where was that doubt when it really mattered? Where was your critical thinking when you accused me of something so serious? You believed him over me without even questioning it. And now I'm supposed to be okay just because you've figured out the truth. Rebecca sent me text after text, apologizing repeatedly. She begged me to come back home, told me she was sorry for not believing me, admitted she had made a mistake, and wanted to fix things. But I wasn't sure I even wanted things fixed anymore. I knew I had to respond, but I wasn't sure what to say. There was no way I could go back and pretend nothing had happened. My trust in her was shattered, and it wasn't just about the lie. It was about the fact that she could believe something so damaging about me so easily. How do you recover from that? So, I texted her back and said, "I'm glad you believe me now, but I can't risk it happening again. I can't trust Zach, and to be honest, I don't trust you either. I don't want to live in a house where I'm constantly worried about being accused of something like that again." Her response was heartbreaking. She asked me what she could do, said she'd do anything to make it right. I knew she meant it, but the truth was, I didn't know if anything could make it right. She asked if I wanted her to give up custody of Zach and Chloe. That was something I hadn't even considered. I never thought it would come to that. But now that she mentioned it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. If Zach wasn't in the house, I wouldn't have to worry about another false accusation. But what kind of person would I be if I asked her to give up her kids for me? I told her I loved her, and I still did, in a way. But I also told her that I couldn't live in that house with her kids. I didn't trust it. I didn't trust them. I said I wasn't expecting her to give up her kids for me, but I couldn't see another way for us to move forward. It felt like an impossible decision, and I knew no matter what, someone would lose. When I hit send, I wasn't sure how she'd react. Would she be angry, hurt, or beg me to reconsider? But what she said next completely caught me off guard. She was actually considering it. Rebecca told me she had thought about giving up custody of Zach and Chloe so we could stay together. I was stunned. This wasn't just a throwaway comment. She was seriously thinking about it. She wanted to make it work that badly. But it didn't feel right. How could I let her do that? Her kids needed her, even if Zach had lied. What kind of relationship would we have if it was built on something like that? It was a no-win situation. A few days went by and I was still processing everything. We were texting, but I was keeping my distance. Meanwhile, Rebecca's ex-husband Kyle caught wind of what was going on. And let's just say, he wasn't happy. Out of nowhere, I received a call from Kyle. I didn't recognize the number at first, so I let it go to voicemail. Big mistake. The message he left was filled with anger. I'll never forget his voice. He was furious, asking why the hell his ex-wife was talking about giving up custody of the kids and what kind of "whoa" was going on in our house. At that point, I knew I had to talk to him. I couldn't avoid it, so I called him back. The second he picked up, it was like I was hit with a freight train of questions. He was pissed, and honestly, I didn't blame him. "Kyle, what the hell is going on, man? Why is Rebecca saying she might give up the kids? Zach and Chloe are my kids too. You don't just make decisions like that without talking to me." I said, "Look, Kyle, It's complicated. Zach accused me of something that didn't happen, and it's thrown everything into chaos. I never wanted Rebecca to give up custody, but after Zach did that, I can't go back to that house. Kyle was silent for a second, and I could tell he was processing everything. So Zach lied. That's what this is about? Yeah, that's the gist of it. Rebecca believed him at first, but now she knows it was all made up. But it's too late. The trust is gone. I can't live there with them, not after what happened. Kyle let out a long sigh, and for a second, I thought he was about to explode again. But instead, he just sounded tired. I can't believe this is happening. Zach's a good kid, but I don't know what's gotten into him lately. He's been acting out, but this is beyond anything I imagined. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't in the business of psychoanalyzing a 10-year-old. All I knew was that Zach's lie had wrecked everything. Look, I'm angry, but I get where you're coming from. I don't want my kids in the middle of this mess either. But Rebecca giving up custody? That's not happening. I didn't argue with him. Honestly, I was relieved he felt that way. The last thing I wanted was for Rebecca to go through with something she'd regret for the rest of her life. We agreed to leave it at that for now, and I hung up feeling like I'd dodged a bullet, but knowing that nothing had really been resolved. A few days later, Rebecca texted me again. This time, it was different. There was no apology, no back and forth about custody. She wanted to meet in person. She said she needed to talk face to face. No more texting. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. I mean, yeah, we'd been married for 5 years. But seeing her in person after everything felt like too much. Still, I agreed. Mostly because I didn't see how we could keep texting forever. We had to face each other at some point. We met at a park halfway between my parents' place and the house. When I got there, she was sitting on a bench, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red, and she had this desperate look on her face. I sat down next to her, leaving enough space between us that it didn't feel too close. "Rebecca, I'm losing everything. I can't do this anymore." I didn't know how to respond. What do you say to that? I felt like I'd already lost everything, too. "I'm sorry, Rebecca. I didn't want it to be like this." She just shook her head, looking away, tears starting to well up in her eyes. I can't believe my own son lied like that. I can't even look at him right now. He's staying with Kyle full-time, and I don't even know when I'll see him again. There it was, the raw truth. Rebecca was falling apart, and Zach had ruined not only my life but hers as well. I didn't want to see her like that, but at the same time, I couldn't forget what she'd done. She had doubted me when I needed her trust the most. I don't know what to say. I'm not sure there's anything to fix here. I can't come back, not with Zach in the picture. But I need you, she said, and then paused, taking a deep breath. I'm pregnant. My heart stopped. I wasn't expecting that, not even close. I just stared at her, trying to process what she had said. Pregnant? Now? In the middle of all this? How far along are you? I asked. 12 weeks. I just found out a few days ago. I didn't know what to say. It felt like everything had just gotten 100 times more complicated. Rebecca, I'm scared. I don't want to go through this alone. I'm sorry for everything, for not believing you, for all of it. But please, don't leave me now. I could see the panic in her eyes, and for a moment, I felt guilty. Like maybe I was abandoning her. But then I remembered everything we'd been through, everything Zach's lie had caused. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about protecting Lucy and me too. I'm sorry, but I can't do this. I can't come back and pretend everything's fine just because you're pregnant. We're still getting a divorce. Rebecca's face crumpled, and for the first time in a long time, I saw her break down completely. She cried, and I just sat there watching her. There was nothing else I could do. I felt like the worst person in the world, but I knew I had to stand my ground. After that, we sat in silence for a while. I didn't know what else to say, and she didn't either. Eventually, I stood up and told her I had to go. She didn't try to stop me. I think she knew it was over. She knew things were beyond repair. As I walked back to my car, I felt like something inside me had finally snapped. This was it. There was no turning back, no second chances. I had done everything I could, but in the end, it wasn't enough. I drove home feeling numb, like my whole world had collapsed. Maybe it had. The days that followed our conversation at the park felt surreal. I was facing a divorce, a false accusation from a kid I thought I was beginning to bond with, and now a baby on the way. It was as if life kept throwing more challenges at me, and I was just standing there, taking it all in. I kept telling myself to stay strong for Lucy, but it was tough. Rebecca and I didn't communicate much after that. We went back to texting, but the tone was different now. She wasn't begging me to come back anymore. Instead, she seemed resigned, as if she had finally accepted that our marriage was really over. The divorce papers were already in motion, and we had agreed to keep things as civil as possible for the sake of the kids. But no matter how calm we tried to remain, there was always that huge elephant in the room. The baby. I didn't know how to feel about it. Part of me wanted to be excited. After all, a baby is a big deal. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have been overjoyed. But these weren't normal circumstances. I was angry, confused, and honestly terrified about how this would play out. Co-parenting with Rebecca was already going to be complicated with Lucy, and now we were adding a newborn into the mix. I tried not to think too far ahead, though. I focused on getting through each day, one step at a time. I had to make sure Lucy was okay, that she wasn't affected by all the chaos happening around her. A week or two after our talk, Rebecca sent me a long message about Zach. She told me their relationship had completely fallen apart since the whole incident. Zach had moved in with Kyle full-time, and Rebecca barely heard from him anymore. She tried calling, texting, and even showing up at Kyle's place, but Zach wanted nothing to do with her. Honestly, I wasn't surprised. Kids can be cruel sometimes, and Zach was probably feeling the weight of his lie. He knew what he had done, and now that everything had come to light, it seemed like he couldn't face the consequences. So instead of trying to make things right with his mom, he just shut her out. I felt bad for Rebecca. No matter what happened between us, I didn't want her to go through that. No parent deserves to be cut off from their child like that, especially not when they're so young. She told me she was heartbroken and didn't know how to fix it. I didn't have any advice to give her. What could I say? She had believed Zach when he told the lie, and now that the truth was out, their relationship was shattered. It wasn't like I could just swoop in and fix everything. If anything, I was part of the reason things were broken in the first place. Even though I didn't ask for any of this, there were moments when I'd sit and think about everything that had happened, and I'd be hit with an overwhelming sense of guilt. I knew it wasn't really my fault, but it felt like it. Rebecca was losing her relationship with Zach, and now she would have to go through this pregnancy alone. She had to deal with the divorce, raise Chloe, and manage a broken relationship with her son, all at the same time. I kept replaying the moment in the park when she told me she was pregnant, how scared she looked, and now, here I was, living at my parents' place with Lucy, while Rebecca was left to pick up the pieces. It was hard not to feel responsible for some of it, even though I knew Zach's lie was the catalyst for everything. But that's the thing about guilt. It doesn't care about logic. I didn't reach out to Rebecca to talk about it, though. I kept my distance. I figured the less we talked, the easier it would be to get through the divorce and move on. But that didn't stop the guilt from creeping in, especially at night when I was alone with my thoughts. After a few more weeks, things started to settle a bit. The legal matters were progressing, and Rebecca and I had come to an agreement about Lucy. We'd share custody, and I'd stay involved as much as possible. It wasn't the ideal situation, but it was better than nothing. Rebecca was still struggling with Zach, though. She had tried to reach out to him again, but Kyle wasn't having it. He was still angry about the whole custody conversation, and I couldn't blame him. If the roles had been reversed, I would have been just as furious. Rebecca told me she hadn't seen Zach in over a month. He was ghosting her, and she didn't know how to handle it. She even tried talking to Chloe about it, but that only made things worse. Chloe was confused and upset by everything and didn't want to be caught in the middle. The whole family dynamic had completely fallen apart. I didn't know how to help. I wasn't in a position to offer advice or be there for Rebecca in the way I used to. I had to focus on Lucy, on building a stable life for the two of us. Still, hearing Rebecca's messages felt like a punch to the gut. I could hear the pain in her words, and I hated that I couldn't do anything about it. Rebecca's pregnancy continued to loom in the background. Every few days, she'd update me on how she was feeling, how the baby was doing. It was strange knowing I was going to be a dad again, but not being a part of the process, like I was with Lucy. I wasn't going to be there for the doctor's appointments, the ultrasounds, or even the birth. It felt distant, like I was watching it all from the outside. We talked a little about how we would handle things once the baby was born. Co-parenting was going to be tricky, especially since we'd be living apart, but we agreed we'd figure it out as we went. We didn't have much of a choice. Rebecca promised she would do everything she could to ensure Zach didn't cause any more issues, but despite that, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too little, too late. The damage had already been done. Looking back, this whole situation feels like a slow-motion train wreck. I never wanted any of this to happen, but once it started, there was no stopping it. One lie from Zach, and my entire life turned upside down. Now, here I am, trying to pick up the pieces and figure out what comes next. Rebecca is about to have a baby. We have to figure out how to co-parent during a divorce. Zach is barely in the picture, and Lucy is the only thing keeping me grounded. All I can do is keep moving forward and hope that someday things get better. The day I officially received the divorce papers was the strangest feeling. I'd been expecting it, waiting for it. But when it actually arrived, I just stared at the envelope for a while. I wasn't sure why it hit me so hard. It wasn't like it was a surprise. Rebecca and I had both agreed this was the direction we were heading. Still, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of the life I thought I would be living for much longer. I didn't open the envelope right away. I just left it on the kitchen counter and tried to distract myself with Lucy. She's so intuitive. She could tell something was wrong, even though I was putting on my best everything's fine act. She kept asking if we were still going to the park later, almost like she was testing to see if the plan was still on. I promised her we'd go, no matter what. It's moments like that when you realize just how much kids pick up on, even when you think you're hiding things well. Lucy didn't know about the divorce yet, not the full picture. I told her that her mom and I weren't going to live together anymore, but explaining the reasons behind it, I wasn't sure how to do that without overwhelming her with adult problems. She didn't need to know the details. She just needed to know I was there for her, no matter what. Meanwhile, Rebecca was in her own world of chaos. She was dealing with the final stages of pregnancy, the divorce, and trying to rebuild her relationship with Zach. I'd hear bits and pieces through her texts about how hard it had become to even get Zach to respond to her. He was still living full-time with Kyle, and from what Rebecca told me, he wasn't talking to her much at all. I didn't say much when she vented about it. What could I say? It wasn't like I could swoop in and fix that relationship. Zach had made his choices, and Rebecca was dealing with the aftermath. I felt for her, honestly. I may have been angry with her for how everything went down between us, but no parent deserves to lose their relationship with their child. From what I could see, Zach wasn't budging. There were even a couple of times when Rebecca hinted that maybe I could talk to Zach, try to help fix things, but that was a non-starter for me. I told her straight up, "That's between you and him. I can't get involved." I didn't want to make things worse by sticking my nose into that mess. Zach had already made his feelings clear about me, and I wasn't about to jump back into that fire. When Rebecca's due date finally came around, I wasn't there. That was the hardest part. With Lucy, I was at the hospital by Rebecca's side, holding her hand the entire time. This time, I was sitting at my parents' house, waiting for a text to let me know it was over. I'll never forget that feeling, knowing my child was being born, but I wasn't there. I kept pacing around the house, checking my phone every 5 minutes, waiting for an update. Finally, around 3 a.m., I got the message. He's here. It was a boy, my son. I didn't know what to feel. There was a rush of happiness, because, let's be real, a new life coming into the world is always something to celebrate. But there was also this pit in my stomach, like I was already missing out on so much. I wasn't there to hear his first cry. I wasn't there to hold him for the first time. Rebecca sent me a photo later. He was tiny, wrapped in a hospital blanket, with a little hat on his head. He was perfect. And I wasn't there. The first few weeks after the baby was born were complicated. Rebecca and I were trying to figure out how to co-parent, but it was messy. She needed help, but I wasn't living there anymore, and I had Lucy to think about too. There was constant back and forth about when I could come over to see the baby, how often I'd be involved, what was fair, and all of that. I went over a few times to help, but it was awkward. There was this wall between us now. We weren't just parents anymore. We were divorced parents. Every interaction was colored by this unspoken tension, like we were both just trying to get through it without bringing up everything that led us here. But holding my son for the first time, that was something else. He was so small, and I kept thinking about how much I had already missed, even though he'd only been alive for a couple of weeks. I wanted to be there for him, to be the dad he needed, but how was I going to do that from a distance? Co-parenting with Lucy was already hard enough, and adding a newborn to the mix made it feel impossible. Rebecca was still dealing with Zach's absence, and it was weighing on her. She tried to hide it, but I could see how exhausted she was. She'd talk about not knowing how to juggle everything. Being a mom to Chloe, raising a newborn, and trying to fix things with Zach. I didn't have the answers, and I wasn't in a position to offer much support beyond being there for the baby. After a couple of months, things started to settle into a weird kind of normal. Rebecca and I worked out a routine for sharing time with the baby, and Lucy was adjusting to the new situation. I'd have Lucy with me most of the time, and then I'd go over to Rebecca's a couple of days a week to see the baby. It wasn't ideal, but we made it work. There were still plenty of moments when I felt disconnected, like I was only getting bits and pieces of my son's life. But that was the reality now. I had to accept that I couldn't be there every second, that I had to let go of the idea of a normal family, because nothing about this was normal. Lucy, though, she was a rock star through it all. She took to being a big sister like it was second nature, and seeing her with the baby brought a little light into the mess. She didn't care about the divorce or the custody issues or any of the adult drama. All she cared about was her baby brother, and that was enough for her. Now, looking back at everything that's happened, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. One false accusation, and everything unraveled. My marriage, my family, my life. It's all been flipped upside down. But somehow, I'm still standing. I've got Lucy. I've got my son. And I'm trying to build something out of the wreckage. It's not perfect, and it probably never will be, but it's the life I have now, and I'm doing my best to make it work.